This is a short video about Gothic literature. Please know that you can take an entire course in Gothic literature. I'm just going to focus on a couple key points to help you understand some of the short stories that we're reading. When you think of the word Gothic, you might think of a style of dress, you might also think of Gothic architecture, or you might think of Gothic literature. And Gothic literature is characterized by not only dark and macabre subject matter, but also really interesting and elaborate settings like castles and dungeons and abandoned plantations. This quotation from the Norton Anthology, I think, is really helpful. In the context of the Romantic period, the Gothic is then a type of imitation medievalism. So the Gothic is a way of reinventing the past and making the past present. This is a picture of Strawberry Hill House, which was built by Horace Walpole, who many consider the first Gothic writer. He wrote a novel called The Castle of Otranto. He also happened to be the son of the Prime Minister. So this castle isn't actually Gothic, but was built to look medieval, was built to look kind of imposing and medieval and maybe even a little bit sinister and romantic. So this was built in the late 18th century or 1700s. So the Gothic or Gothic literature is a reimagining of a past that maybe never really was. So it would almost be as if people today created some sort of structure or house that gave the appearance of being really old and of another time, but actually it was quite new. Let's talk about some Gothic characteristics. So like I said, ancient castles. When you think of Gothic architecture, you might think of really elaborate cathedrals with gargoyles and flying buttresses and turrets and passageways. Dungeons and labyrinths, you can see how the settings can become really symbolic, especially when we're dealing with psychological trauma or horror. Labyrinths and dungeons and things that are repressed and kept in the dark, those are just ripe for metaphors. Supernatural occurrences like ghosts or curses, omens, even some perversion like incest or really tyrannical patriarchs. Oftentimes there is a damsel in distress. So on the one hand, Gothic literature is really horrifying and violent, and there can often be sexual violence in Gothic literature. But on the other hand, you often see young women who are up against all odds and capable of doing pretty amazing things. So on the one hand, it's been accused of being kind of crass and low, but on the other hand, Gothic literature I think is more complex than that. Women oftentimes have unexplained illnesses, irrationality and passion, and the idea of the pleasurably terrifying. In the Romantic period, and Gothic literature, at least to most critics, is a subset of the Romantic period, although some would argue it's something kind of different or an offshoot of the Romantic period. People were interested in aesthetic categories, not only of the beautiful or the picturesque, but also of the pleasurably terrifying. So what it's like to stand on the top of the Alps looking down and feeling like you're so small, or what it's like to be caught in a snowstorm, or what it's like to look down at a canyon and know that you could die. So the pleasurably terrifying. You're scared, but you kind of like it. And Gothic texts themselves are sublime experiences, right? We're scared, but we also know that it's just a story. We also know that it's pretend. There is a subset of Gothic literature. There are several subsets of Gothic literature that I want to talk about, and it's the American Gothic or Southern Gothic. So this is inspired by Gothic literature of England, but it's distinctly Southern. So when we think of Southern Gothic literature, these time frames and these parameters, they're kind of loose, right? But we think of it as being after the Civil War and up to the 1960s. But you can see some elements of Southern Gothic literature in some TV shows or some films or some novels that you read today. With Southern Gothic, we see a lot of dark, ironic humor. If you've read any Flannery O'Connor and been disturbed, but you also find yourself laughing at something that's horrifying and disturbing, you know what I mean when I say dark, ironic humor. The grotesque. Think about what the South represents, right? On the one hand, we have images that we see in films like Gone with the Wind of this elaborate, ornate, pastoral world of the South. But we all know what that was built on, right? Enslaving human beings. So with Southern Gothic literature, we have that really interesting contrast between what some people remember about the South versus the rot at the center. And the rot is often in Southern Gothic, the rot of the institution of slavery. We often have damaged or delusional characters who are living in the past. You may have heard this famous line from Faulkner that something like, "The past isn't dead, it isn't even past." So things that seem as if they're happening in the past are still present. If you've read any Toni Morrison, if you've read a novel like Beloved, you can think about how settings, just like how settings of castles or dungeons in Gothic literature in England can be metaphorical, right? How they can reveal something about the labyrinthine nature of our minds or our twisted, repressed desires that we lock away in dungeons. The same thing can be true of a decaying old house or a decaying old plantation. What might that represent? Not just the house itself, but what might it represent? Violence, racism, poverty, betrayal, hypocrisy. These are things that you see, or themes that you see in all sorts of literature, of course, but you might notice it in Southern Gothic literature. Southern Gothic literature has been sort of denigrated or viewed by some snobbish critics as being overly violent or over the top or too regional. But now we study it in mainstream classes, it's in anthologies, and I think it's a really helpful way of understanding the Gothic as a whole, and also a helpful way of understanding our history. Here's a list of some writers that many people would consider Southern Gothic. Keep in mind, some of these writers, like Edgar Allan Poe, don't necessarily fall squarely into the Southern Gothic tradition. It might depend upon the text that you're looking at. Other writers have some novels that have elements of Southern Gothic, and other novels that we wouldn't really categorize as Southern Gothic. So some of this is open to interpretation. I want to leave you with a question. Why do you think it is that Gothic literature is so appealing to so many of us? Gothic literature is not over. We still see elements of the Gothic anytime we watch a TV show about vampires or about the supernatural or about an abandoned castle. Why is it that the Gothic appeals to us? Romanticism was a rejection of Enlightenment thinking, a focus on imagination and emotion and invention and artistry and getting back to nature. And the Gothic, as a subset of Romanticism, is a rejection of Enlightenment thinking too. But it's kind of an unleashing of excess of all of these emotions that are really primal emotions. That's why some consider the Gothic to be over the top, and that's why for a long time Gothic literature wasn't really respected. So what is it about the Gothic that is so appealing? Is it about catharsis, living out our repressed desires and fears through something else? Is it about this idea of the sublime, being terrified or awe-inspired but in a pleasurable way? Or a third theory, is it a way of writing about things that are too traumatic or difficult or horrific to write about in more literal terms? After all, we see a rise in Gothic literature when there are moments of political or social upheaval, whether it was the French Revolution or the Civil War and Reconstruction and segregation. What is it about about Gothic that makes us able to understand the world in a more meaningful way?